Broken heart, I'm fine. The words that made Hyunjin even more worried. The sound of something shattering inside Felix's room made Hyunjin drop the glass of water in his own hands. Thinking, he ran down the dim hallway, his heartbeat pounding louder than the thunder outside. Rain hammered against the dorm windows as he reached Felix's door. It was locked. Felix opened the door. Silence, the kind of silence that felt heavier than any scream. Then after a long moment, a quiet voice finally came from the other side. "I'm fine, Hyunjin." 3 simple words, and somehow they terrified him more than anything else. Hyunjin pressed his forehead against the cold wooden door. That wasn't the sound of someone who's fine. No answer. The storm outside continued to rage, but the one inside his chest was far worse. For weeks, something had been changing. Felix, the person who always laughed first, who baked brownies at midnight and dragged everyone into spontaneous movie nights, had become quieter, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice. But Hyunjin noticed everything, the way Felix smiled without showing his teeth, the way his eyes lingered on old photographs, the way he spent longer and longer staring out the window after everyone had gone to sleep. The others believed he was simply tired. Hyunjin knew better. Because Felix had a habit. Whenever he carried unbearable pain, he would become gentler, kinder, softer, as if he were preparing himself to disappear without leaving anyone angry at him. And that terrified Hyunjin. The lock finally clicked. The door opened just enough for Felix to peek outside. His blonde hair was messy, his hoodie sleeves covering half his hands. A forced smile appeared. "Sorry," he said softly. "I dropped a mug." Hyunjin looked past him. The room was neat, too neat. Except for the broken ceramic pieces on the floor. A mug Hyunjin had given him 2 years ago. Felix noticed his gaze. It slipped. But his voice carried something heavier, regret. Hyunjin entered without asking permission. The scent of lavender candles filled the room. Felix always used them whenever he couldn't sleep. Rainwater rolled down the windowpane, turning the city lights outside into blurred streaks of gold and blue. Hyunjin crouched beside the broken mug. "Do you remember this?" Felix nodded. "You gave it to me after our first concert tour. You said it was your lucky mug." Another nod. "Then why did you throw it?" The question hung in the air. Felix looked away. "I didn't throw it." But Hyunjin had known Felix long enough to recognize every tiny lie. The truth lived in the silence between his words, and tonight that silence was deafening. Felix sat on the edge of his bed. "I'm just tired." Hyunjin remained where he was. "No." Felix laughed quietly. "What do you mean no?" "I mean you're not just tired." Laughter vanished. Outside, lightning illuminated the room for a split second. For that brief moment, Hyunjin saw it, the exhaustion, the sadness, the loneliness Felix had been desperately hiding. Then darkness returned, and so did the mask. Felix smiled again. "I'm fine." Those words, again, the same words, each repetition made Hyunjin more afraid. Because people who were truly fine never needed to say it so many times. Hyunjin stood, his chest felt tight. There was a memory he couldn't forget, 3 years ago, before their debut anniversary celebration. Felix had spent an entire week acting cheerful, cooking for everyone, making jokes, smiling brighter than usual. Only for Hyunjin to discover later that he had been struggling alone, carrying homesickness so severe that he cried himself to sleep every night. Back then, Felix had said the exact same thing, "I'm fine," and Hyunjin had believed him. He would never make that mistake again. The rain softened into a gentle rhythm. Felix stared at his hands. "I know you're worried," he whispered. Hyunjin sat beside him. "Then why won't you tell me?" A long pause, the kind that seemed to stretch forever. Finally, Felix spoke. "Because if I say it out loud," his voice trembled, "it becomes real." Hyunjin turned toward him. Felix rarely showed fear. He was the person who comforted everyone else, the sunshine, the safe place, yet tonight he looked like someone standing at the edge of an invisible cliff. "What becomes real?" Felix swallowed, his fingers tightened around the fabric of his hoodie. "Been thinking about things, about whether people eventually get tired." Hyunjin frowned. Tired of what? Of always being the strong one. Room grew quiet. Rainwater continued its endless journey down the glass. Felix's golden brown eyes reflected the city lights. "When everyone sees you as sunshine," he said softly, "sometimes you feel guilty for having cloudy days." The word struck Hyunjin harder than he expected, because suddenly everything made sense, the endless smiles, the forced laughter, the exhaustion. Felix wasn't afraid of being sad. He was afraid of disappointing everyone by being sad. Hyunjin felt his throat tighten. "You know that's ridiculous, right?" Felix chuckled. "Maybe. Nobody expects you to be happy all the time. They expect Felix." The answer came so quickly that it revealed how long he'd been carrying that belief. Hyunjin stared at him. For the first time in weeks, Felix wasn't pretending, and the truth was heartbreaking. The thunder outside had disappeared, only the rain remained, gentle, patient. Listening, Hyunjin moved closer. "Do you know what I think?" Felix looked at him. "I think the strongest people are the ones who admit when they're hurting." Felix smiled weakly. "That's easy for you to say." No, Hyunjin shook his head. It's difficult, that's why it matters. Silence settled between them, comfortable, fragile, real. Then Hyunjin noticed something on the bedside table, a plane ticket, Sydney, departure date 3 weeks from now. His heart skipped. Why did Felix have a ticket, and why hadn't he told anyone? Felix followed his gaze. Instantly, his expression changed. Panic. He reached for the ticket, but Hyunjin had already seen it. Felix, no answer. The rain stopped entirely. The world outside became eerily still. Why do you have this? Felix looked down. His voice was almost inaudible. I wasn't planning to tell anyone yet. Air suddenly felt heavier. Hyunjin's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Another long silence. Then Felix finally spoke. Been thinking about going home for a while. Words felt unreal. Home, Australia, leaving. Questions exploded inside Hyunjin's mind. How long? Why now? Why alone? But beneath all of them was one overwhelming fear. Had Felix already decided something without telling anyone? The same person who kept repeating that he was fine. The same person whose smile had been slowly breaking apart. Hyunjin looked at him carefully. And in that quiet room, surrounded by the scent of lavender and broken pieces of old memories, he realized something that made his heart ache. Felix wasn't asking for solutions. He wasn't asking to be fixed. He was simply waiting for someone to notice that he wasn't fine. And Hyunjin silently promised himself that no matter what happened, he would never look away again. The next morning arrived with a sky so bright that it almost felt cruel. Sunlight poured through the dorm windows as if the storm from the night before had never existed. But Hyunjin had barely slept. The image of that plane ticket remained burned into his mind. Sydney, 3 weeks. No explanation, no answers. And Felix had still ended the conversation with the same gentle smile. Really okay, Hyunjin, don't worry too much. Those words echoed endlessly in his head. People who wanted others to stop worrying were often the ones carrying the heaviest burdens. Hyunjin found Felix in the kitchen. As usual, he was making breakfast, pancakes. The sweet scent of butter and vanilla filled the room. Anyone walking in would think everything was perfectly normal. Felix hummed quietly while flipping another pancake. His expression was calm, too calm. Hyunjin leaned against the doorway, didn't sleep. Felix looked up and smiled. A little. You're lying. A small laugh escaped Felix. Good morning to you too. Familiar warmth in his voice should have comforted Hyunjin. Instead, it made his chest ache. Because Felix had always been incredibly good at pretending, the others soon entered one by one. Laughter filled the kitchen. Nobody noticed anything unusual. Nobody saw the exhaustion hiding behind Felix's bright expression. Nobody except Hyunjin, and perhaps that was what frightened him the most. How could someone be hurting so much while still making everyone else feel comfortable? Later that afternoon, practice began. The studio buzzed with energy. Music thundered through the speakers. Sweat and determination filled the air. Felix performed flawlessly. Every movement was precise. Every smile looked natural. Yet Hyunjin noticed the little things. The extra seconds Felix remained seated during breaks. The way he stared into empty space whenever nobody was watching. The way he quietly rubbed his wrist as if grounding himself. During lunch, the others went out to buy drinks. For the first time all day, the practice room became silent. Only Hyunjin and Felix remained. Felix sat against the mirrored wall, his knees drawn up, his headphones resting around his neck. Hyunjin walked over. You can fool everyone else. Felix looked up. But not me. A quiet smile appeared. Is that supposed to be comforting? Supposed to mean you don't have to keep acting? Felix lowered his eyes. For several moments neither spoke. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the wooden floor. Dust particles floated through the golden beams like tiny stars. Finally, Felix broke the silence. Do you ever get tired, Hyunjin? The question caught him off guard. Tired of what? Being the version of yourself everyone expects. Hyunjin sat beside him. The question lingered in the air. Carefully he answered. Sometimes. Felix nodded. As an idol, people always remember your brightest moments. His voice was soft. They remember your smiles, the jokes, the happy videos. Nobody really sees the nights when you sit alone and wonder if you're enough. Hyunjin listened quietly. For the first time, Felix was allowing pieces of his inner world to surface. Been doing this for years, Felix continued, being positive, being strong. The person who comforts everyone. A faint laugh escaped him, and somewhere along the way I forgot how to ask for comfort myself. The words pierced straight through Hyunjin's heart because they carried no bitterness, only exhaustion, pure, overwhelming exhaustion, the kind that built slowly over years. Hyunjin looked at him. Why didn't you tell me? Felix remained silent, then he smiled sadly. Because you're always carrying your own burdens. Answer made Hyunjin angry, not at Felix, at himself. Had he really missed so much? Had Felix been quietly drowning while everyone celebrated his strength? The practice room suddenly felt too large, too empty. Wish you trusted me more, Hyunjin whispered. Felix turned toward him. Do trust you. Then why keep everything inside? A long pause. The sunlight had begun turning orange. Evening was approaching. Finally, Felix spoke. My grandmother used to tell me something. Hyunjin listened. She said that people become homesick for more than places. His voice trembled slightly. Sometimes they become homesick for versions of themselves that no longer exist. The words settled heavily between them. Hyunjin understood. Felix wasn't only missing Australia, he wasn't only missing family. He was grieving pieces of himself, the boy who laughed without expectations, the teenager who dreamed without pressure, the person who existed before millions of eyes watched his every move. Tears threatened to form in Hyunjin's eyes, but Felix was still smiling, still pretending everything was manageable, still saying he was fine. And somehow that hurt more than tears ever could. The others eventually returned. The moment laughter filled the room again, Felix transformed, the sadness disappeared, the bright energy returned. Nobody noticed the conversation that had just happened. Nobody noticed the quiet ache hidden behind his eyes. That evening, Hyunjin couldn't stop thinking about the plane ticket. After dinner, he found Felix sitting on the rooftop, the city lights stretched endlessly beneath them. A cool breeze carried the scent of rain-soaked concrete. Felix looked peaceful, but Hyunjin had learned that peace and loneliness often wore the same face. He sat beside him. The silence between them was familiar, comfortable, until Hyunjin finally asked the question he'd been holding back. Long were you planning to stay in Australia? Felix froze. The wind grew stronger. Several seconds passed. Maybe a few weeks. Hyunjin waited, or longer. Answer made his stomach drop. Longer. Felix stared at the distant skyline. I don't know. Felix, I really don't know. The first time uncertainty completely overtook his voice. No rehearsed answers, no reassuring smiles, just honesty, raw and frightening. Hyunjin felt his heartbeat quicken. Are you thinking about leaving everything behind? The question came out quieter than intended. Felix closed his eyes. The city lights reflected against his pale skin, and after a long, painful silence he finally answered. I'm thinking about finding myself again. Words weren't dramatic, they weren't loud, but they carried a sadness deeper than tears, because somewhere inside them existed a truth Hyunjin wasn't ready to face. What if Felix wasn't running? If he genuinely believed that the version of himself everyone loved had slowly disappeared? And what if going home was the only way he knew to look for it? Hyunjin looked at his best friend beneath the endless night sky and realized something terrifying. The person he had always depended on for warmth and comfort was quietly trying to remember how to save himself.
The following days passed with a strange kind of normality. The world continued moving as if nothing had changed. Schedules remained busy. Practice sessions went on. Laughter still echoed through the dorm, and Felix still smiled. But Hyunjin now understood that some smiles were not signs of happiness. Sometimes they were shields, and Felix had spent years perfecting his own. One evening, after another exhausting day, the members gathered in the living room to watch an old concert video. The screen illuminated their faces with memories from years ago. Everyone laughed at their younger selves, the awkward hairstyles, the nervous expressions, the silly mistakes. Even Felix laughed, a genuine one. For a moment, Hyunjin felt relieved. Then the camera showed a backstage clip. A younger Felix appeared on the screen, grinning brightly as he spoke about his dreams. I want to make people happy, his younger self said. I want to become someone people can lean on. Room grew quieter. The others smiled fondly, but Hyunjin noticed Felix stop laughing. His expression changed, only slightly, yet enough for someone who knew him. Without a word, Felix stood up. I'm going to get some water. Questioned it, nobody except Hyunjin. A few minutes later, he found Felix standing alone on the balcony. The city below glittered under the night sky. Cars moved like streams of light. The air carried the distant sounds of life continuing elsewhere. Felix leaned against the railing, silent. Hyunjin approached carefully. You left because of the video. Felix didn't deny it. His fingers tightened around the bottle of water. Do you ever look at your younger self, he asked softly, and wonder if you disappoint them? The question made Hyunjin pause. Felix continued before he could answer. That kid had so much certainty. A sad smile appeared. He believed he could make everyone happy. Wind gently moved his hair. But nobody tells you how exhausting it becomes when you keep trying to carry light for everyone else. Hyunjin listened. Every word sounded like something Felix had kept hidden for years. I thought becoming stronger meant never letting people see you break, Felix admitted. So every time I felt overwhelmed, I just smiled harder. Confession hung in the cool night air. Hyunjin's heart ached, because Felix wasn't talking about a few difficult months. He was talking about years. Years of believing that his value depended on being okay. Years of thinking that vulnerability was failure. The loneliness of that realization felt unbearable. Hyunjin moved closer. Nobody expects you to save everyone. Felix looked down. I know. Then why do you keep trying? Silence, the city lights reflected in his eyes. Finally, he answered. Because I'm afraid of what happens if I stop. Honesty in those words stunned Hyunjin. Fear, not responsibility, not expectations. Fear. Fear that people would love him less. Fear that disappointment would replace affection. Fear that the version of Felix everyone cherished only existed when he was smiling. Hyunjin suddenly remembered something from years ago. During their trainee days, Felix had once practiced alone until 3 in the morning. When Hyunjin asked why, Felix had laughed and said, "If I work harder, maybe I won't become a burden." At the time, everyone thought it was simply determination. Now, Hyunjin understood. It had never been determination. It had been fear, the same fear that still followed him, the same fear that convinced him he had to earn love by never breaking. A cold breeze passed between them. The silence remained gentle, not empty, just full of things neither knew how to fix. Then Hyunjin made a decision. "Come with me." Felix blinked. "Trust me." Half an hour later, they arrived at a small park near the dorm. It was nearly midnight. The playground was empty. Streetlights painted golden circles on the ground. Everything felt strangely peaceful. Felix looked confused. "Why are we here?" Hyunjin smiled. "Because years ago, when we were trainees, you brought me here." Recognition slowly appeared in Felix's eyes. The memory returned. A difficult day, endless practice. Hyunjin had been overwhelmed, and Felix had dragged him outside to this exact place. They had sat on the swings until sunrise. No advice, no grand speeches, just company. "You told me something that night," Hyunjin said. Felix remained quiet. "You said that people don't always need solutions." He turned toward him. "Sometimes they just need someone willing to stay." The words settled deeply between them. For the first time that evening, Felix's expression softened. A real softness, not the carefully controlled version. Hyunjin sat on one of the swings. "So tonight I'm staying." The night air felt cooler now. The stars peeked through the clouds. Felix slowly sat beside him. Neither spoke for several minutes. The gentle creaking of the swings filled the silence. Eventually, Felix laughed quietly. "I completely forgot about this place." "I didn't." Another silence. Then Hyunjin asked the question that had lived inside his heart since finding the plane ticket. "Do you really want to leave?" Felix looked toward the dark sky. "I don't know." Honesty remained, no pretending, no rehearsed reassurance, just uncertainty. "I miss home," he admitted. "I miss being someone's son instead of being Felix from Stray Kids." The confession was heartbreakingly simple. Hyunjin understood. There was comfort in being ordinary, in being loved without expectations, in returning to places where nobody needed you to be strong all the time. "But I also don't want to abandon everyone here," Felix continued, his voice cracked. "And that's what hurts." Internal conflict was finally visible. Home or responsibility, rest or guilt. Self-discovery or fear of disappointing others. A battle with no easy answer. Hyunjin looked at his friend. The person who always prioritized everyone else. The person who apologized even when he was hurting. The person who kept saying he was fine. And for the first time, Hyunjin realized something important. Felix didn't need someone to convince him to stay. He needed someone to tell him that choosing himself wasn't selfish. The realization settled quietly in his heart. The night grew deeper. The city became calmer. And somewhere in that small playground, two friends sat beneath the stars, learning that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is admit that they are tired, and trust that the people who love them will remain, even when the sunshine fades. The next week arrived more gently than Hyunjin expected. For the first time in a long while, Felix seemed lighter, not completely, not enough to erase the shadows beneath his smiles, but lighter. And Hyunjin learned that healing rarely happened all at once. Sometimes, it was simply the courage to let another person stay close. The morning sun filtered through the dorm windows when Hyunjin woke up to an unfamiliar sound. Music. Soft, nostalgic music. He followed it into the kitchen. Felix was baking chocolate chip cookies. An old playlist played quietly from his phone, songs from Australia that he used to listen to during his trainee days. The warm scent of vanilla filled the air. For a brief moment, everything looked peaceful. Felix noticed him. Morning. Hyunjin leaned against the counter. "Couldn't sleep." Felix chuckled. "Actually, I woke up early." Answer surprised him. That hadn't happened in months. Hyunjin watched as Felix carefully placed another tray into the oven. There was something comforting about his movements. Something familiar, the Felix who found peace in small acts of kindness. Yet Hyunjin had learned not to mistake peaceful moments for complete healing. People could smile and still carry heavy storms inside. They sat together in silence while waiting for the cookies. The soft morning light painted everything gold. Finally, Felix spoke. "I called my mom yesterday." Hyunjin turned toward him. "How was it?" A gentle smile appeared. "Good." But this time, the smile reached his eyes. "We talked for almost 3 hours." Warmth in his voice was unmistakable. "I told her everything." Hyunjin blinked. "Everything," Felix nodded. Exhaustion. The confusion. Homesickness. His fingers traced the edge of his mug. "And do you know what she said?" Hyunjin waited. Felix laughed softly. "She told me that I've always been terrible at asking for help." Sound of genuine amusement filled the kitchen. It was a small thing, yet Hyunjin treasured it because real laughter had become precious. "My mom said something else too," Felix continued. "She told me that coming home doesn't mean running away." Words lingered. Hyunjin thought about them carefully. For weeks, he had feared that Felix wanted to disappear, that he wanted to leave everything behind. But perhaps that wasn't true. Perhaps Felix simply wanted to breathe, to remember who he was beyond expectations and responsibilities. The oven timer rang. Felix stood up. The sweet aroma of fresh cookies spread through the room. It reminded Hyunjin of countless late nights, moments when Felix baked for everyone after difficult schedules, moments when he expressed love through small gestures instead of words. Suddenly, Hyunjin realized something. Felix had always known how to care for others. He simply never learned how to care for himself. That evening, the members gathered in the living room again. The atmosphere was warm, relaxed. Laughter filled every corner. Felix passed around the cookies. Everyone praised them. The happiness looked real. And perhaps it was. Healing didn't erase pain. It simply allowed joy to exist alongside it. Later that night, Hyunjin found Felix sitting by the window. The city lights stretched endlessly beyond the glass, the familiar position, the familiar silence. But something had changed. The loneliness that once surrounded him felt softer now, less isolating. Hyunjin sat beside him. Thinking again, Felix smiled. Always. A comfortable silence followed. Then Felix spoke. "I used to think being strong meant enduring everything alone." Reflection in the window showed both of them, two silhouettes against the night. "But maybe I misunderstood strength." Hyunjin listened carefully. "My grandmother always said that trees survive storms because they bend." Felix's voice was calm. "They don't try to fight every wind." Wisdom in those words settled quietly between them. For so long, Felix had been trying not to bend, trying to remain perfect, unshaken, bright. No matter how strong the storm became, and perhaps that was why he had grown so tired, because nobody could carry endless sunlight alone. The world simply wasn't built that way. Hyunjin looked at him. "So what happens now?" The question lingered. Felix stared at the stars barely visible above the city. "I think," he paused, "I think I need to go home." Hyunjin's heart tightened. But this time, fear didn't immediately follow, because Felix wasn't speaking like someone escaping. He was speaking like someone searching. "I need to see my family. I need to remember the version of myself that existed before all of this." A small smile appeared. "And then I want to come back." Words brought unexpected relief. Come back, not goodbye, not forever, just a journey toward himself. Hyunjin let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Then you should go." Felix turned toward him, surprised. "Really?" Hyunjin nodded. "Because if home helps you heal, then that's where you need to be." Emotion flickered across Felix's face, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. For years, he had worried that choosing himself would disappoint others. Yet here was someone telling him the exact opposite. The silence that followed was gentle, peaceful. Then Felix laughed quietly. "You know, you're different these days." Hyunjin raised an eyebrow. "How?" "You listen more." A playful smile formed. "And you worry way too much." Hyunjin rolled his eyes. "Whose fault is that?" Felix laughed again. The sound filled the room with warmth. Real warmth, not forced, not performed. And for the first time in many weeks, Hyunjin realized something important. Felix still carried pain. He still had fears, still had questions without answers. But now he no longer carried them entirely alone. The night grew deeper. The city continued glowing beneath the stars. And somewhere between quiet conversations and unspoken promises, two friends began understanding that sometimes the words "I'm fine" are not lies meant to deceive. Sometimes they are simply wishes, tiny hopes that one day, with enough love and enough courage, those words might finally become true.
A few days later, the departure date on Felix's plane ticket no longer felt like a secret hanging over the dorm. The members knew everyone had reacted differently. Some were surprised, some were worried, but nobody tried to stop him. And perhaps that was the greatest gift they could give: understanding. The evening before his flight, the dorm was unusually quiet. Schedules had ended early. Rain tapped gently against the windows, bringing back memories of the night everything had begun. Hyunjin stood outside Felix's room. The door was open this time, no silence, no locked handle, just soft music and the warm glow of a bedside lamp. Felix sat on the floor, organizing old photographs. Some were from Australia, others were from their trainee days, a lifetime captured in small pieces of paper. Hyunjin entered quietly, preparing for the trip. Felix looked up. He held up a photo. Two younger versions of themselves smiled at the camera, exhausted after practice but undeniably happy. Hyunjin laughed. "We looked terrible." Felix grinned. "We looked alive." Answer carried no sadness, only nostalgia. Hyunjin sat beside him. The room smelled faintly of lavender again, but this time the scent felt comforting instead of lonely. Felix placed another photo into a small box. "Do you ever think about how strange life is?" Hyunjin tilted his head. So Felix stared at the image in his hands. "When we were younger, we wanted everything to happen faster." His voice remained soft. "We wanted success, recognition. We wanted our dreams to come true." A quiet chuckle escaped him. "And now sometimes I wish I could slow everything down." Honesty in his words felt familiar, not painful anymore, just human. Hyunjin nodded. "I think everyone feels that way eventually." Rain continued falling outside, gentle, patient. Like a conversation that didn't need interruptions, Felix leaned back against the bed. "I used to believe that moving forward meant never looking back." His eyes remained fixed on the photographs. "But maybe looking back isn't weakness. Maybe it's how we remember what matters." Hyunjin listened. The Felix sitting beside him now was different from the person who had hidden behind endless reassurances. There was still sadness, still uncertainty, but there was also acceptance. A willingness to acknowledge his own feelings instead of burying them. The growth was subtle, yet profound. Hours later, the others gathered in the living room. Takeout boxes covered the table, movies played in the background. Laughter returned to the dorm. The atmosphere felt warm, bittersweet. Nobody spoke much about tomorrow, nobody needed to. Some things became more meaningful when left unspoken. Late into the night, Hyunjin found Felix standing on the balcony once more. The rain had finally stopped. Fresh air filled the city. Felix looked up at the stars. "I was scared," he admitted suddenly. Hyunjin leaned beside him. "About leaving?" Felix shook his head. "About telling everyone that I wasn't okay." Confession lingered. "For so long I thought people only loved the cheerful version of me." A small smile appeared. "But I was wrong." Hyunjin looked at him. "Of course you were." Felix laughed quietly. "Know that now." Sincerity in his voice brought a strange sense of peace. Fear that had consumed him for months seemed smaller, not gone but manageable, like a storm finally moving beyond the horizon. Then Felix turned toward Hyunjin. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." Moment of hesitation. "What made you realize something was wrong?" The question surprised him. Hyunjin thought carefully. "The answer wasn't complicated. It was your words." Felix frowned. "My words?" Hyunjin nodded. "Every time I asked if you were okay, you said exactly the same thing." He smiled gently. "I'm fine." The familiar phrase hung between them. "And somehow," Hyunjin continued, "the more you said it, the more worried I became." Silence followed, the kind that carried understanding rather than pain. Felix lowered his gaze. "My grandmother used to say that hearts speak even when mouths refuse to." Another soft laugh escaped him. "Maybe mine wasn't as quiet as I thought." Hyunjin shook his head. "No, people who love you notice." Stars above seemed brighter tonight. Or perhaps the weight inside their hearts had simply become lighter. Felix folded his arms against the cool breeze. "You know what I realized?" "What?" He smiled. "Being strong doesn't mean protecting everyone from your sadness." City lights reflected in his eyes. "It means trusting people enough to let them stay when you're hurting." The words settled deeply. Months of exhaustion, weeks of fear, countless moments hidden behind forced smiles, and now this understanding, simple, beautiful, true. Hyunjin looked at his best friend and saw someone learning to be gentle with himself for the first time in years. Someone discovering that vulnerability was not failure, that asking for help was not weakness, that being loved had never required perfection. The night continued quietly around them, no dramatic promises, no tearful goodbyes, just two friends standing beneath an endless sky. And for the first time since that stormy evening when a broken mug shattered the silence, Hyunjin finally believed Felix's words, not because Felix said them, but because his eyes carried a piece they hadn't held before, a small, fragile piece, the beginning of healing, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of finding home within himself once again. The morning of Felix's departure arrived with a sky painted in soft shades of gold and blue. The world felt strangely calm. No heavy rain, no dramatic storms. Just the quiet beauty of a new beginning. The dorm was awake earlier than usual. Everyone gathered in the kitchen, sharing breakfast together. There was laughter, there were old stories. There were gentle jokes about bringing back Australian snacks. Nobody treated the moment like a farewell, because it wasn't. It was simply a pause, a chance for someone they loved to breathe. Felix sat among them, listening more than speaking. For once, he wasn't trying to make everyone comfortable. He wasn't forcing himself to be the brightest person in the room. And somehow that made his presence even warmer. When it was finally time to leave, the members accompanied him downstairs. The morning air was cool, fresh, full of possibility. The car waited quietly near the entrance. Felix looked at everyone, his eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you," he said. The words were simple, but they carried everything he couldn't fully express. The others smiled. Chan pulled him into a hug. The others followed one by one. Laughter mixed with emotions too deep for words. At the very end, only Hyunjin remained for a moment. Neither of them spoke. The memories of the past few weeks filled the silence between them, the stormy night, the locked door, the broken mug, the endless repetitions of 3 heartbreaking words. "I'm fine." Hyunjin smiled softly. "You know," he began, "I used to hate hearing that sentence." Felix laughed. "I know. Every time you said it, I worried even more." Gentle morning light reflected in Felix's eyes. "I'm sorry." Hyunjin shook his head. "Don't apologize." A quiet breeze passed through the street. "Just promise me one thing." Felix tilted his head. "What is it?" "Next time you're not okay." Hyunjin paused. "Don't wait until everything becomes too heavy." Sincerity in his voice made Felix's smile tremble. For a long moment he said nothing, then he nodded. "Promise." And for the first time that promise felt real. No masks, no fear, just trust. Felix looked toward the sky. "Think I finally understand something." Hyunjin waited. "Home isn't only a place." A soft smile appeared. "It's the people who remind you that you don't have to carry everything alone." The words settled warmly in the morning air. Hyunjin felt his chest tight, not from sadness, but from relief. The kind of relief that comes when someone you love finally allows themselves to rest. Felix opened the car door, then suddenly stopped. He turned around one last time. "Hey, Hyunjin." "Yeah?" A familiar grin appeared on his face, this time genuine and unburdened. "I'm going to be okay." Sentence was different now, not a shield, not an excuse, not something spoken to protect others from worry. It was hope, a quiet belief in tomorrow. Hyunjin smiled. "I know." Car slowly disappeared down the road. Morning sunlight covered the city. Life continued moving forward. Weeks later, postcards began arriving from Australia. Photographs of beaches, family dinners, sunsets painted across endless skis. Small handwritten messages filled with warmth. One message remained in Hyunjin's mind forever. It read, "I spent years believing that being loved meant always being strong. But now I know that real love stays, even when you're tired, even when you're lost, and even when all you can say is that you're trying your best. Thank you for staying when I couldn't find my own light." Months later, Felix returned, not as a different person, but as someone kinder to himself, someone who understood that sadness was not failure, that asking for help was not weakness, that even the brightest sunshine deserved cloudy days. One quiet evening, the two of them sat together on the rooftop once again. The city lights stretched endlessly below. The stars watched silently above. Hyunjin glanced at his friend. "Are you feeling?" Felix smiled, a real one, warm, peaceful, human. And this time when he answered, there was no fear behind his words. "Doing better," he said, "not perfect, not invincible, just better." And somehow that truth was far more beautiful than pretending to be fine. The wind carried their laughter into the night. The storm that had once frightened them had long since passed, but its lesson remained. Sometimes, the people who always shine the brightest are the ones who need someone to sit beside them in the dark. And sometimes, the greatest act of love is not fixing someone's pain, but staying long enough for them to believe that they never had to face it alone. The end.